It is Wednesday, June 27th, 2018, and you're listening to 3000 NFL Mock Draft, a Seahawks podcast with myself, Kenneth Arthur, and Rob Staton. And we are talking about, well, the Seahawks, as usual. And we're going to talk today about the extension signed by Danielle Hunter over with the Minnesota Vikings, and talking about how that affects a very similar player to him, Frank Clark, who is also, has an upcoming free agency and may potentially need an extension himself. So we're going to talk about that, and then we'll get into some other situations for the Seahawks right now in the end of June, right into the dead part of the off season right now. So we are going to begin with that. Also, you may have heard some intro music, I believe. If you didn't, then that means I did something wrong, and this part of the podcast is very confusing. But if you did, then we'll get into who to thank for the new music and so on and so forth. But starting things off, like I said before, we're going to talk about the contract situation for the Seahawks in regards to Frank Clark and how that is affected by the new contract signed by Danielle Hunter. Danielle Hunter, who was also in the 2015 draft like Frank Clark, and also a defensive end, of course. And he went around later than Clark did to the Seahawks. He signed a 4-year, $72 million extension. That's an average of $14.4 million per year, with $40 million guaranteed. And that is significant for a lot of reasons. For Minnesota, it's interesting because now they have two of the highest paid defensive ends in the NFL on an annual basis between him and Everson Griffin. So they've put a lot of money into their defensive line. Of course, they're now playing around Sheldon Richardson in Minnesota. So a lot of money on that defensive line. And the Seahawks are, they have an opening right now with the fact that they have moved on from Richardson, Michael Bennett, and Cliff Averill. And certainly Frank Clark seems like an integral part to how they're going to have a pass rush and a defensive line worthy of, being blocked by opposing teams. So, Rob, what were your first thoughts when you saw the numbers on Danielle Hunter in terms of just Danielle Hunter, the player that he is, and the amount that he's being paid right now?
I think it's further evidence that the Minnesota Vikings really know what they're doing with contract extensions in getting ahead of the curve. So if you look at the terms of the deal, it looks as if it's going to be something like $14.5 million on average a year, which is almost exactly the same contract that Everson Griffin got about a year ago. And they get these players signed up well in advance of the market being set, and they get a discount. Everson Griffin has been one of the more productive pass rushers in the NFL during his career, which is now going into an 8th or 9th season. Danielle Hunter has been pretty decent, and they've got them at $14.5 million. If you look at the Olivier Vernon deal that the New York Giants did a couple of years ago, they ended up paying him $17 million a year. And Chandler Jones in Arizona got a $16.5 million a year deal from the Cardinals. So this is actually lower than the highest point of defensive ends. Now, Danielle Hunter's production has not been the same as Chandler Jones's, for example. But what I think it shows is that the Vikings understand that this is a very expensive market, defensive lineman, and then they managed to get their players signed, as they did with Sheldon Richardson, at a decent price, comparatively speaking. And I think what it does for the Seahawks is it actually gives them a way to turn to Frank Clark and say, listen, look, here's another player who's come into the league at a similar time to you, and has maybe had the same kind of impact, has not been the guy, the star on a defensive line so far, but has been a really nice contributing piece, and he's getting $14.5 million, and then they can work from that starting point. I don't think Frank Clark now can say, well, I want $17 million or $16.5 million a year, but he can realistically say to the Seahawks, $14.5 million, the market's been set, are you going to give it me? And then it's whether the Seahawks actually want to pay that or not.
And so, that it also, with as you were alluding to, it seems like a lot of times now with contracts and extensions and stuff, teams feel that they can look at the numbers that they have available to them and the players that they have on their roster already that they know they don't have to train. They know who they are personally. They've become accustomed to them, and then the way they are in the locker room and with the other people on the team. I think that's where you can get into these situations where very talented players don't stick around organizations for long because teams have really come to know them personally in a way that is maybe not that pleasing on a day-to-day basis. especially when you are paying them exorbitant sums of money. And so it seems like you get guys who are very good players who maybe have potential to do a lot more, and are young, so you know that they can grow. And certainly we've seen players. The NFL is interesting, because we see players sometimes become Pro Bowl, All Pro 6-7 years into their career, and really there can be, if the scheme is right, or if the situation is right, there can be an explosion in production, and they can become very, I feel like even Calais Campbell is an example of a guy who was very good for a long time, and then now he's great. And playing on the Jaguars, he's the best version of Campbell that you can get. But in that same situation, and that on that same token, you also get the guys who are like, oh, this guy is now, because the team extended them at a time when they felt like they should do it early, and they like the guy and they don't want to lose him. He's being paid like a top 5 player, but nothing on the field would say that Danielle Hunter screams like a top 5 defensive end, even in just a 4-3 scheme. And only 4 guys on multi-year deals, including Griffin, his teammate, are making more. So do you see that happening? Do you see that as a trend where, I think even guys like, there were a number of center contracts recently, like Brandon Lindor or Ryan Jensen, where they're getting paid a lot of money. And I don't know that we had necessarily associated with them before those deals with being that valuable. So sometimes it seems like it works out, maybe like an AJ Boye, who really has lived up to his contract, even though it's only been 1 year. And then other times it doesn't work out. And you're like, how is, I'm not trying to throw him under the bus, I'm just the first name that came to mind, but how is Vinny Curry getting paid as much as Vinny Curry was getting paid? Someone like that. Do you see that situation being an issue for teams and players, and even with Frank Clark?
Well, possibly so. I think that one thing that's happened in the NFL is that we've seen a lot of teams suddenly become a lot richer than they were in the past, because the cap has continued to rise and rise. They've got more money to spend. There are teams now, there seems to be sort of an established plan. The Seahawks led the way on this with Russell Wilson, get a quarterback on a rookie contract and then build around him. And I think teams, when they do get these rookies in and they're paying them very, very low amounts of money at the quarterback position, they think that frees up an ability to go and spend at other positions. So if you've got a particularly solid center, like some of the names you were talking about there, then okay, we'll pay him $10 million a year, and then in 2 or 3 years' time, that deal will be expendable. We can cut it if we want to get out of that deal when we go and pay the quarterback. I mean, the Jacksonville Jaguars have set their entire roster up so that they have a number of quite old veterans on the team that they can either cut, or their contracts are set to expire right at the moment when the likes of Jalen Ramsey are going to be ready to negotiate a new contract. It's quite a clever plan that they've got. So they've really got front-loaded deals on a number of veterans, and they were big spenders again in free agency, as they were last year. And then when those contracts get to a point where they can move on, they're just going to shift that money to the players that are progressing, and that's, it's almost like a little farm system they've got there, where they're going to end up paying the guys as they get to the end of their contracts. The one thing they haven't got, of course, is a quarterback, and that might be an issue for them down the road. But I think that is something that teams are doing. And with Frank Clark, I think the Frank Clark conversation, Kenny, is one of the more fascinating things to delve into, because there are so many strands, so many negotiating tactics that both Frank Clark and the Seattle Seahawks could use in trying to get a new deal done. I mean, it is huge. Just very quickly to run through some of those. Are the Seahawks going to turn around to Frank Clark and say, "Listen, we drafted you in the second round when a lot of teams didn't even have you on the board. Are you going to, we've trusted in you, we've given you the opportunity. Are you going to repay us by maybe taking a bit of a discount here?" How would Frank Clark feel about that? Does Frank Clark feel a sense of loyalty to the Seahawks because of that? And are the Seahawks not even having to say that to him? Is he willing to negotiate a deal with them that will secure his family for the long-term future, but not necessarily force the Seahawks to spend a ridiculous amount of money, like $16 million a year, for example? How would the Seahawks feel about maybe making him the second highest paid player on the team, which is probably what he will be if and when he gets a new contract? Do they feel that he warrants that kind of level of trust and faith? And do you do that now when perhaps the price is going to be a little bit cheaper? Or do you do it at the end of the season when potentially he could have 12, 15 sacks because he's got that potential in him, and then it's almost impossible to re-sign him, because in that situation, he would be going to free agency. He would potentially be getting the huge money that would be on offer there for a player that has just going from strength to strength. So, there are a million other things we could get into here. I'm sure we're going to talk about them and whether or not the Seahawks should even sign Frank Clark to an extension. But I think it's a fascinating little dilemma for the Seahawks that is going to present over the next few months.
So, what is what's the baseline, for Frank Clark? Where are we headed here with that? Because I know Joel Corey of CBS, he was asked by one of our writers on Twitter about what Daniil Hunter contract could mean for Frank Clark. And Corey's response being, well, just because Daniil Hunter did under his market value doesn't mean Frank Clark has to, and that in fact Frank Clark's deal would be much more than 4 years, $72 million, and potentially in the $17 or $18 million range. And certainly we're getting to that point now with non-quarterbacks where $20 million per season is going to be the new baseline for players of a certain caliber. Certainly that I think it's interesting. Even like a guy like Olivier Vernon, who is the highest paid defensive end in the NFL still right now on a per year basis, not including the franchise tags given to DeMarcus Lawrence and the other guy, I can't remember. But like Olivier Vernon doesn't scream like the most impactful player in the NFL at that position. Not that he's not great, not that he doesn't create a lot of pressures, but we're not talking about the Reggie Whites or the JJ Watts or even like, the Joey Bosa's, the truly elite players from that edge. So with Frank Clark, I certainly think we're going to get to that point here pretty soon where $18 or $19 million per year starts to be a viable option. And that doesn't really matter to any of us. It shouldn't matter to any fans if the salary cap is going up. If the salary cap continues to go up, who cares? It's only a matter of the amount of percentage that you took up of the cap. So with that being said, and knowing the situation that the Seahawks are facing, given that they've lost 5 or 6 starters that they had been relying on in the last 4 or 5 years, what's the baseline for what you're comfortable with Clark?
Well, I think what I'm comfortable with and what the Seahawks are comfortable with might be a little bit different. I think that maybe Joel Corey is maybe overestimating the situation there a little bit, because Frank Clark has got some history there, and there are going to be, when he hits free agency, there are going to be some teams that just think it's not worth our while. There may be some teams that don't have him as a consideration at all, let alone to pay him, $18 to $20 million. And whether or not Olivier Vernon and Chandler Jones have set the market for that position or not, the fact is that right now, on the 27th of June, as we have this conversation here, Kenny, Daniil Hunter is the latest pass rusher to sign a new contract, which is $14.5 million. So the Seahawks are well within their rights to go and say this is what the market is today. Olivier Vernon was 2 or 3 years ago now. We're seeing markets come down. There was that initial boost for certain positions. The safety market's ice cold now. The running back position is ice cold. I think we may see it at other positions as well, where the price and teams start to haggle a little bit to get these prices down. So I would think that you'd be looking at a similar deal. I think it's probably more likely to be closer to the Griffin and Hunter deals than maybe Olivier Vernon. That said, what do the Seahawks actually want to pay? Because these are the things that they've got to consider. Frank Clark has shown genuine potential to develop into, in my opinion, one of the NFL's best pure pass rushers. In the build-up to his draft, I remember saying to you, I think in a podcast, and I wrote in several articles, that he had a top 10 ability. It was the off-field question marks that meant he was going to drop. He was big, he was explosive, he was quick. He was the very definition of a modern-day pass rusher. He ran a 4.5 short shuttle, which is incredible. He's 271 pounds, but managing a 38.5-inch vertical. He's got the 35-inch arms and a decent 40. I mean, physically, he was the complete package, and we've seen glimpses of that on the field. He has shown that he could be one of the very best 3-down defensive ends in the league. That's his potential to develop into that, but he's not consistent really enough. You see games where he's absolutely dominant and unstoppable, and then you see games where you barely even notice he's on the field. He needs to be the man now as well. The Seahawks have lost Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill. He was probably quite happy being the number 3 guy, not too much pressure on him, not too much reliance on him to have an impact over the course of a whole season because the 2 veteran guys were there. He was the third wheel. Well, now he has to be the guy. He has to step up and be the guy, and that's a different challenge for him this year. And the Seahawks presuming they don't sign him to a new contract before the season starts, are going to find out a lot about him. Now, if he steps up to the plate and becomes the guy, that not just the guy on the field, but maybe takes on more of a leadership role within that locker room as well. It's just a younger team now. It's a newer team. If he can do those things, they might be quite comfortable paying him $16, $17 million or 14 or whatever. If he continues to be the Frank Clark that we've seen so far, which is kind of 9-10 sacks, 2 or 3 of those will come in the same game. He's more of an 8 or 9 game a season type of guy instead of a 13, 14 game a season type. If he's not really shown that after 4 years he's become the best, then do you want to commit a huge amount of your salary cap to this guy? So that's another thing that they have to consider. And then I'm going to argue the other point, which is the Seahawks might not have any choice, because you look around the roster at the moment, who is it's the weakest position is pass rusher. They've got Frank Clark. They've got a bit of promise in Dion Jordan if he can stay healthy. They're hoping that Rasheem Green can do something. They're hoping that the likes of Mingo and Smith and others can chip in there. But ultimately, they don't have a great deal of depth there. So they are. If they're not paying Frank Clark, they've got to go out and find somebody. In the market next year, if they said, right, we'll go and get Anthony Barr instead, well, they're going to pay Anthony Barr $20 million a year instead. I mean, these are the kind of things that they've got to consider here. There's a lot going on, and the things that will ultimately work against him as well are the off-field flags, are the fact that it's looking like a really good draft for defensive ends next year in the 2019 draft. That could affect him in free agency. It could affect him with the Seahawks if they want to draft a guy and pay him a lot less. So there are so many different strands. I'm not sure whether the Seahawks will even want to pay him 14.5 with the way they were so strict with their cap in the last offseason. I think they want to get him on more of a Michael Bennett type deal than the types of deals that we're currently talking about. That's what I think. Personally, I'd probably be quite happy to pay him the 13, 14, 15 million type range. I think the Seahawks will try and get him in Michael Bennett range instead.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's one thing about it, that the Seahawks don't have, a ton of money going to, after this year, they don't have a ton of money going to Richard Sherman, Cam Chancellor, Michael Bennett, Cliff Averill. And it seems like the option, they're simply not going to sign an Anthony Barr. They're not, they've nothing in their history to either shows that they are going to go out. I'm trying to think of a single defensive player that they've ever signed to a large free agent contract, and since Pete Carroll took over, at least in the terms of the years that they've been, competitive, 2012 on, they've added guys on the second or third tier like Cliff Averill and Michael Bennett, who then increased their value after they became Seahawks, and they've traded for Sheldon Richardson on a 1-year deal. But there's nothing that seems to signal in the Seahawks recent history that they're going to become players on the free agent market. So it does seem like they are more apt to allocate those free agent dollars or those salary cap dollars to players currently on the roster, guys that they've grown and built and found themselves. And then with that, if Rasheem Green becomes the player that they want him to be, or a piece of that player that they want him to be, in the same way that they thought Malik McDowell would, then, that's where the savings would seem to benefit them, in the sense that if they're paying Frank Clark $16 million in 2019, if that's all $16 million that they're paying to defensive ends, and then another, $4 to $7 million on all the other defensive ends combined, which maybe even it's less than that. We don't know what's going to happen with some of these other guys that are currently on the roster, but it does seem like the plan could be that because they don't have Averill and Bennett to pay anymore, that they are not really spending any additional money on defensive end. They're simply giving a larger piece of the pie to one player, and then hopefully saving money and having a quality defensive end in Green. We'll see also, too, what happens with Dion Jordan, because we don't know if Dion Jordan's going to play in a way this year that increases his value so much that the Seahawks don't want to lose him. Certainly, it could be a situation where they could still, up until the beginning of the season, look at Dion Jordan and maybe hopefully he recovers from his knee injury quickly and without any issues. And they could say, hey, do you want a contract that goes from 2019 to 2020 and it pays you $10 million because, you haven't really done that much yet? Or do you want a contract for a 2-year? It's a risk for Dion Jordan. It's a risk for the Seahawks. But it does seem like that could be something where, with the money coming off of the books, it doesn't seem like they're really allocating that much to defensive end. So they could, in fact, or theoretically pay a larger sum to Frank Clark, but it doesn't really seem like they go out and they sign big name free agents. So it does seem like that's going to be their most viable strategy. Some of the free agents on the 4-3 market next year are set to include Ezekiel Ansah, who's the other guy that's on the franchise tag, and DeMarcus Lawrence. Both of those guys obviously playing on the tag, and either they'll play well and get huge contracts, or they something will happen to the negative. But I assume they're both going to get paid. Then you've got Cam Wake, who's on the older side, of course. Carlos Dunlap, who may be one of the most underrated defensive ends in the NFL and certainly will be expensive. Brandon Graham, Dante Fowler, Julius Peppers, Michael Johnson, Khalil Mack, who's obviously very expensive pretty soon. William Hayes. So there's some guys out there. Anything standing out to you in terms of options there? A Carlos Dunlap or a Dante Fowler Jr., or do you think that it'll just be something that we have to watch and see how it plays out this season?
Well, the Jaguars seem quite willing to move on from Dante Fowler Jr., so I'd be interested to see what happens to him when he becomes a free agent eventually. This is a big season for him, and I just wonder whether he's going to be the kind of guy who moves around the league for like 1 or 2 years. I think having the knee injury so early in his career has probably not helped him at all. Obviously, there are some big names among that list that you mentioned there, Kenny. I think that Dunlap's probably getting on a bit now. He's been in the league an awful long time. I think it's very unlikely the Seahawks are going to go and make big free agent splashes, because it's not even just Frank that they've got a big decision to make here. Within the next year, they've got to decide what they're going to do with Earl Thomas. They've got to decide whether or not to start negotiating with Russell Wilson, and when that conversation needs to start and when it's most beneficial. That has to, and that we saw from Russell's last contract that he's not just going to roll over here and take a decent deal from the Seahawks just to be. He was very, very competitive with his agent last time, and I think it could be a bit of a battle this time as well. So that's something they've got to be prepared for. Bobby Wagner, KJ Wright. Do you look after these guys? And there are others as well that you could sort of throw into the mix. And they sign players on these 1-year deals or short-term deals, and the hope is that they're going to go on and prove themselves. Most of those signings that they've had of recent, like Eddie Lacy, for example, Luke Jokel, haven't worked out. Bradley McDougall did. They re-signed him. They'll be hoping that some of these guys, the Dion Jordans, for example, can come in, and the Colemans and maybe warrant an extension too. So there's a lot of things coming up. So I don't think there's going to be a huge rush to go and sign any big name outside free agents. And the one other thing that I mentioned a little earlier, Kenny, with regards to this topic is the 2019 draft. It looks as if it's going to be the draft for defensive ends. I mean, already there are a good 5 or 6 names, not just defensive ends as well, interior pass rushers too, that could go into the draft and make a legit case to be top 15 picks. The top end of the next year's draft is going to be, it's going to be very light on quarterbacks this year, which is a big contrast to the last couple of years, and it's going to be very heavy on defensive linemen. So the Seahawks can maybe look at that and say, okay, whether you sign Frank Clark or not, we're going to use an early draft pick on a defensive lineman. We're going to look at that position, because I think a lot of teams are going to be thinking that way. And that too could impact Frank Clark, and it could impact one or two of the other. It won't impact Khalil Mack, who's going to get a huge deal because he's Khalil Mack, but it might impact some of the other guys, including Frank Clark, as to what teams are actually willing to pay them.
And looking around at the rest of the Seahawks on the salary cap, for 2019 and beyond, it's interesting because, right now for the Seahawks, next year, they have to talk about Frank Clark, but they also have to talk about some other guys, of course, Earl Thomas, Dwayne Brown, KJ Wright, Justin Coleman, Dion Jordan, Marcus Smith, some of the other guys, we'll see if they even pan out. They're on 1-year deals that, but for some of these guys, that becomes, another issue. And then once you get, through 2020, the Seahawks don't have anyone signed past 2020. Cam Chancellor, Doug Baldwin, Justin Britt, Bradley McDougald, Ed Dixon are among the guys who are on free agent contracts that are signed through 2020. So through the next 3 years, that's it. And Russell Wilson's final year is in 2019. So Russell Wilson's got 2 years left on his deal. But we also know that the NFL is negotiating a new CBA that'll come around in 2020. I mean, they will have to do that with the Players Association. And a lot of people expect that will lead to, a lockout or a strike or whatever it is. I never know exactly what causes the difference between the two, which is probably a very ignorant thing on my part that I've revealed. But the Seahawks don't have any contracts past 2020. Do you find that to be a consideration? Do you find that to be something? Because the Seahawks and every team in the NFL certainly have to think about what that means for the deals, whether or not that'll make it more difficult or players more expensive or cheaper. I don't know exactly what the complications are. But teams also do have to sign players. And Danielle Hunter did just sign a 4-year extension, meaning that, the first 2 years of that deal, it doesn't seem like they are going to cut bait with Danielle Hunter at 2020. So what sort of considerations or complications, whether it's Frank Clark, Russell Wilson, Earl Thomas, or anyone else, does it come when we're looking at that upcoming date in 2020?
Well, I kind of want to say that I hope there's not going to be a lockout. I take what you're saying there, but I mean, the salary cap for the NFL in 2017, for example, was about $168 million, if I'm not mistaken. In 2012, it was a $120 million. So the salary cap's gone up by $48 million in a 5-year span. And that's got to be, the players have got to acknowledge that. I mean, whatever angst the players might have currently with NFL owners about certain topics, whether that's Deflategate or the protests or other issues that get talked about a lot, they still have to recognize that salaries have gone through the roof over the last few years. And the second contract nature of the situation now, whereby you get into the league, you get your first contract out of the way, the veterans are getting paid huge money. I mean, if you're an NFL guard right now, you're not clamoring for a lockout, are you? I mean, your salary's just gone shooting through the roof in the last couple of years, especially offensive linemen, defensive linemen, quarterbacks. We've seen receivers still get a lot of money, as we saw in free agency recently. The only kind of positions that really are being hampered by this seem to be safety and running back. I kind of hope that has some weight with the players as much as some of the other stuff, and that hopefully there can be a means to progress through this, because at the end of the day, there has to be a league. The players aren't going to break away and form their own league. So there has to be some kind of give and take from both sides here, like there was last time. And if the players negotiated this CBA, I mean, they actually agreed the current CBA. So you can't exactly blame the league, can they? I mean, they didn't have to agree to this. There was a lengthy lockout, and this is the deal that they came to. If they now feel that they didn't get a great deal after all, well, then go back to the league and negotiate better next time. I mean, I hope that there's not going to be a lockout. I appreciate that there might be. Is it a coincidence that the Seahawks don't have anybody signed past 2020? I'm not sure. It could be that it is a coincidence. It could be that it is carefully planned. I think it's probably more than anything, though, a sign that they've just gone through a major shift, that a lot of some of their players that they'd signed on big contracts have left. They haven't signed those third deals. The ones who have signed their third contracts, the likes of Michael Bennett, obviously have moved on. Marshawn Lynch has moved on. Cam Chancellor appears set to move on as well. And I think that would be a question that'll be easy to answer in a year's time when we see what they do with the Russells, the Earls, the KJ Wrights, the Tyler Lockett's, and people like that. Because while that might be a consideration for them, that there's a potential lockout coming in, that the league could be very different after 2020 and stuff like that, and keep your options open. At the same time, they wouldn't want to lose. I don't think they'd want to lose someone like KJ Wright. I think that they see him as the embodiment of what they want in a defensive player. I don't think they will have any interest in losing Tyler Lockett if he comes back and has a really good season. And I think there's one or two others that they'll feel that way. And Frank Clark could be one of those guys they feel that way. And in that case, they will have to sign some of these players beyond 2020. They're not going to be able to just release another big chunk of the roster in a year's time, because that'll make it very difficult. I think the only way that happens is if Pete Carroll moves on and there's a complete change within the organization after this season, which I don't think is particularly likely unless it's a complete disaster, which I'm certainly hoping that's not going to be the case.
Yeah, it also seems like, with regards to any franchise building project, whatever, when it's not just that it all really starts and ends with the quarterback, right? So the main priority for the Seahawks at any time would be, all right, what's the situation with Russell Wilson's contract? And, as long as that's not, putting us in a bad position, and as long as we're in position to make those deals with Russell Wilson, it shouldn't be an issue. And the other interesting thing too, like being that when they do get to 2020, they can get away from literally all of those contracts. They have huge say. All of those 5 guys that I mentioned: Cam Chancellor, Doug Baldwin, Justin Britt, Bradley McDougald, Ed Dixon. They'll save a lot of money if they just release them. And certainly with Cam Chancellor, that's expected immediately. I mean, not immediately, but that's expected. And, Doug Baldwin will be older. Justin Britt, we'll see, like Bradley McDougald, if he earns it, all these kinds of things. So it's like they would also have a ton of flexibility in 2020. And I don't know, that might be the case for a lot of NFL teams because it is 2 seasons from now. You're not necessarily, I'm always saying that teams are only concentrating on the next 2 years. And I think you do want to plan ahead for things like a CBA, obviously, and you want to plan ahead for some things. But really, you're just focused for me on the next 2 years. And so that's always going to be with the quarterback for me. So as long as it's around Russell Wilson, because you can look at Tom Brady and you can talk about Tom Brady's career and say, look at who Tom Brady was surrounded by in his first 3 Super Bowls. Obviously, all of those guys are gone. It was a long time ago. But you could also go back to like the 2014 Super Bowl against the Seahawks and say, the starters for the Patriots at that point around Tom Brady are different now than they were even in 2014 when they won the Super Bowl there. That team had Darrelle Revis and Jamie Collins and Vince Wilfork and Rob Ninkovich and Chandler Jones and Brandon LaFell and Nate Soldier and Brian Stork and like all of these guys who are not on the Patriots anymore, and you just keep reloading on those positions. So it's another thing too where you have good players like Jamie Collins or Chandler Jones and Darrelle Revis, but you also say like, we're not relying on any of these guys to come back next year and we have to reload. So for the Seahawks, do you see how they will reload? Do you see like, if it's through the draft or through those key free agents, it still seems like the Seahawks and Patriots, if you look at their moves with Pete Carroll and since Pete Carroll took over, seem to mirror each other in a lot of ways, both in the draft and free agency. And it seems to be building around the fact that, isn't it all about keeping your quarterback and it being able to consistently reload around that quarterback for 10 to 15 years?
I think for the most part, yes. And the Patriots have shown that. And I think last year's Seahawks are a good example of that as well, because with Russell Wilson, they managed to win 9 games and could easily have won 10 or 11. And it was because of Russell Wilson, because the running game was a complete disaster. The offensive line wasn't very good. Which is an understatement. The defense wasn't as strong as it has been in previous years, and yet they were, very close to making the playoffs, very close to another double-digit win season. And without the quarterback, that doesn't happen. So having a franchise quarterback, having one of the best 5 or 6 quarterbacks in the league, makes you a competitive team every year. It's the most important position probably in all of sports. You have the quarterback, you've got a chance there. I think there's probably a little bit, if there was somebody else on this podcast, Kenny, they might jump in at this point and remind us that the Jacksonville Jaguars had Blake Bortles as their quarterback last year and completely pushed resources, draft and money into their offensive line and the defense and the running game, and therefore the quarterback was just one of the guys as opposed to the guy. And you could make that case as well a little bit for the Eagles with the fact that Carson Wentz got injured and Nick Foles won a Super Bowl. And if we made that, if that sentence was read out 12 months ago, people would be rolling around on the floor in stitches laughing because they just wouldn't believe that Nick Foles was capable of such a thing. And yet the team around him was so good that it helped them to accomplish that and beat Tom Brady and the Patriots in the Super Bowl, of course. So, there's always, I've kind of always felt with the NFL that there are many different ways to win. There isn't one carte blanche way of doing it, that this is the formula and you follow this and you do it and it works. I think there are many different ways to win a game of football, a single game of football. And there are many philosophies and approaches which will enable you to compete for a Super Bowl. I think that the most tried and tested one, though, is to have the quarterback and then surround them with talent on offense. I still think that if you can run the ball and play great defense and you have a quarterback who can be a point guard, which is classic Pete Carroll football, that gives you the best chance to win, because you're going to have to go on the road and win some games. And in the playoffs, typically playoff games are tight, physical contests that become just like a war of attrition, really. And it's that ability to play great defense, run the ball in the second half, which enables you to get over the line more often than not. So I do think that those aspects are important, but you've still got to have a quarterback to make the plays. And I suppose that's one thing you could say of Bortles and Foles in the playoffs last year. They did make the plays when they needed them. So yeah, the quarterback, very important. I do think the Seahawks will look to build around Russell, and that will be the plan. And actually, when you think about it, when he signs his contract and becomes the most expensive paid player in the NFL, it will happen eventually. Most people will say fine. Some people will overreact and say it was a bad move. Within about 6 months, somebody else will be the highest paid quarterback or player in the league. And then Russell will end up being sort of like the 7th and 8th most highest paid player in the league, which he pretty much is at the moment anyway. And we'll all have forgotten about this. And the cap's not going to stop growing. It's going to keep growing. And a deal that seems expensive today will not seem expensive down the line. At least if the Seahawks pay Russell Wilson, they're paying a Super Bowl champion and a guy who came very close to winning 2 Super Bowls, who was a legit MVP candidate, as opposed to paying someone like Matt Stafford, who's a decent quarterback, definitely has the arm talent, but hasn't shown that he can take a team and drag it kicking and screaming into the playoffs and then win some playoff games. So I don't see any issue at all with paying Russell.
Right. And, if that other person was on the podcast talking about bringing up those teams, I would agree that it is certainly a way to compete for a Super Bowl for 1 year. And certainly it's complicated, the team that the Jaguars put together last year was so fantastic and at every position almost, except for a quarterback and certain pieces on the offensive line, that they just hit so well on. They were happy, I'm sure, that the Cowboys and nobody took Jalen Ramsey. They had the money and resources and ability to recruit AJ Bouye and Calais Campbell and Barry Church, and they put together a great defense. And it may even result in them winning a Super Bowl this year. I would say that's the issue with those teams that teams with franchise quarterbacks don't have is sustainability. That we can go back on the constant, sort of examples of Trent Dilfer won a Super Bowl, and we also know that the Baltimore Ravens didn't compete very much after that. And even despite a great defense and despite having some good players, there was always going to be that barrier. And the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 2002, incredible historic defense with more elite players at positions than most teams in history have ever had. And obviously they have not had any success in the last 15, 16 years. And yet the New England Patriots and Peyton Manning and Ben Roethlisberger for a long time were the only quarterbacks to go to the Super Bowl from the AFC. And they didn't always have great players around them, and it didn't require as much perfect planning and roster construction and drafting and hitting in your draft and making the right free agent decisions and luring free agents that, turned out not to be disasters. Even the Seattle Seahawks in 2005, had a very good quarterback, but also, there wasn't going to be a lot more left in Matt Hasselbeck's tank. And, they were certainly built that year around the strong running game and offensive line. And it was not sustainable. And I think that that's certainly an issue that some of these teams like the Jaguars, if the Eagles didn't have Carson Wentz, I'd say they were also going to run into this issue. And I think they were, not the best team in the NFL last season, which, doesn't matter. They won the Super Bowl, but certainly not the best, I think. And they were lucky, I think, to run into Case Keenum in the NFC Championship and, to get to the place that they did get to. And certainly they deserve all the credit for winning the Super Bowl and everything like that. But it does seem to be an issue with sustainability when the New England Patriots really can replace everybody except for Tom Brady and compete for Super Bowls for almost 20 years now. So I do think that there's something to that. But certainly I think the Seahawks, too, the difference between the Seahawks and the Jaguars being that for those years between 2012 and 2015 or, really 2012 to 2014, was that they did have a defense as good as the Jaguars, but they also had Russell Wilson instead of Blake Bortles. What do you think about the Jaguars? If we're going to talk about the Jaguars, like, where do you rank them in the AFC right now and their chances of winning the Super Bowl?
Hard to say. Obviously, they came very close last year because they got to the AFC Championship and possibly should have won that game and got to the Super Bowl. There was a point when it looked as if they were going to make the Super Bowl. So you have to sort of respect what they've done. Absolutely love Calais Campbell as a player and just think he's not underrated because obviously everybody loves Calais Campbell. But I just wonder whether I don't know what's the word for a player who's not underrated, but he's still maybe not quite as respected as he should be. And just the way that he absorbs so much through the middle to allow a pass rush to thrive is just something that I think is a thing of beauty. I think the things that hold back the Jaguars are pretty obvious. It's that Blake Bortles is very capable on a day of helping his team win a game, and he has the running game that will support him, and he has some receiver options that you would think would help him as well. They've signed some more guys this offseason. But he's still a potential liability. And on defense, as good as they are in the pass rush, they have two flaws. And their run defense isn't as good as it should be. And they have this weird knack of giving up big plays in the passing game. And Seahawks fans will be well aware of that. Seahawks were getting hammered by Jacksonville until two very strange and far too easy touchdown throws from Russell Wilson deep down the field suddenly got the Seahawks back into it and potentially in a position to win that game, which they had no right to win. And that's because of the two terrible touchdowns they gave up. And then if you watch the game against the Steelers in the AFC divisional round, they just kept giving up big plays. They gave up one right before half time, and it is very frustrating. You know, the one thing they do lack is that kind of rangy free safety, the Earl Thomas type of player that would finish off that defense. And you would want to see them perform better in the run defense up front. And because of that, you do just wonder that you could see them getting through a couple of playoff games. You could see them winning the AFC South quite easily, getting through a couple of playoff games. But then ultimately one day they're going to come up against a team, and whether that's in the wild card, divisional round, AFC Championship or whatever, they'll come up against a quarterback who will take advantage of their weaknesses on defense. And it'll be the day that Blake Bortles can't have the game of his life and get them over the top. And because of that, I just wonder whether or not they've got the potential to actually go all the way and win a Super Bowl. If they had a great quarterback who you just felt like, listen, if that defense isn't on complete song, you can go toe-to-toe with a Brady or a Roethlisberger or somebody like that and get them to win a shootout. If you had that sort of confidence in Blake Bortles, I think they'd be probably the favourites in the whole NFL to win the title next year. Because you haven't got that and because they do have a couple of weaknesses, I think I'd just hold back slightly. Put Russell Wilson on their team, and I think they win the Super Bowl next year.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting to think about what the Jaguar, and the fact that the Jaguars did hang back and decide to even give Blake Bortles an extension and not go out and try and get involved with, I don't know if they could have gotten involved with someone like Kirk Cousins or because they were really in a tough position because of Blake Bortles' injury that, guaranteed his contract for next season. So it's hard to get involved there. They didn't draft anyone the last couple of years, but also they did make their team really, really good. And the more I've been writing about it, the more I'm also just thinking that the LA Chargers are maybe the best team in the AFC. And since we're just talking about it really quickly, I just think about the fact that maybe Casey Hayward is the best cornerback in the NFL right now. Maybe Joey Bosa could be the best pass rusher in the NFL next season. Melvin Ingram himself is, of course, an elite pass rusher. And they've got a quarterback. They have maybe, this season's best quarterback in the AFC. Phillip Rivers could certainly be that. And they've upgraded their offensive line. Keenan Allen seems to be, potential all-pro receiver. And the AFC itself does not have a lot of great quarterbacks, and could be up for grabs in the sense that either a team with a great quarterback will be able to walk to the Super Bowl, whether that's Tom Brady or Ben Roethlisberger. Because don't get me wrong, the Steelers are also looking really good because they do have a solid offensive line. I think maybe a couple. Obviously David DeCastro could be the best guard in the NFL. Antonio Brown is the best receiver. Le'Veon Bell could be the best running back. And defensively, they do have guys like Cam Hayward. So the AFC's got some interesting players out there, some teams out there But it does seem like, unlike the NFC, where there's a lot of good teams, the AFC has a couple great teams, and maybe it'll come down to that. And it's interesting, but it's also especially interesting because it's June and we're talking about what's going to happen in 6 months. So at this point, speculation and fantasy gets to run rampant. Any thoughts on the Chargers Steelers and in terms of like the quarterbacks too? Because like we are experiencing in the next couple of years that turnover from Ben, Rivers, Brady into whatever the next version of those quarterbacks will be. If that's Deshaun Watson, if that's Andrew Luck, if that's Pat Mahomes, and we can even talk about whether or not there's a quarterback in the AFC in his first couple of years. Obviously, a lot of people like Watson that you think could be could have his run of the AFC for the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, I think it's Deshaun Watson. I think we saw that last year that he's got the potential to do that. Obviously, he's going to come back from the injury. But I think of all the teams in the AFC that I think have got a real opportunity to take a big step forward, it's probably the Houston Texans, health depending. I mean, if they get J.J. Watt back and if they get Deshaun Watson back and if one or two of the younger guys really step up, then, there's a major opportunity for Houston to have a really good run at this. And I like Bill O'Brien as a coach. I think that it's good that they kept him on rather than making another change. So I think that Houston are the team that I would sort of put a ring around and say they're the ones that could maybe take a big step forward. You could see them winning 12 games, for example, and having a real run at this. I think with the Chargers can beat any team in any arena any Sunday. Absolutely. Problem for the Chargers is I know it, you know it, everybody knows it. They'll have a run during the season where they lose 3-4 games, probably in a row, by a point. And it'll be something stupid like a botched punt or a missed field goal or a fumble by the running back as they were running down the clock, and they'll end up losing by a point. And they are the team that seems to shoot itself in the foot more than any other. And when they get hot and when they get on a run, you look at them and you think, wow, these guys could go to the Super Bowl. And you think they've got everything. I mean, Rivers is rocking and he looks great. And they've got the defensive players that you talked about there. And they've got running game. They've got offensive linemen. They've got defensive players across the board. They should be really, really good. And yet they just have this real knack of having these really crappy runs during the season, which stops them winning the division. They end up having to squeeze into the wild card, which they sometimes do, but then they have to go on the road and it becomes difficult. And the other thing about Rivers is I really like Phillip Rivers. He's been the player that I think I've enjoyed watching the most that's not been a Seahawks player since I really started following the NFL. It's been really cool to watch his career. I kind of like his character. And yeah, he has these games where he just makes throws where you just think, what the hell was he thinking with that throw? And there's just a bit too much of that sometimes. He's more than capable of having a huge meltdown in a game. And he seems to have sort of 2 or 3 of those a year as well, which is another reason why they kind of get held back. But could you see the Chargers doing something next year? Yeah, you definitely could. I think the other team worth mentioning, I think the Steelers are they're getting their own way too much. I think there's too much drama going on there. I think there's too many egos at play in that Steelers locker room for them to be a legit potential Super Bowl champion. They just seem to get in the way a bit more. I think the team that might be worth keeping an eye on is Kansas City, just because Patrick Mahomes has got this little bit of an X factor about him. He's kind of got a spark. He's got the arm talent. He's been able to sit for a year. And you just wonder with the players that they've got on that team, and they've still got some really big name players across the board in defense and offense. They've made some big free agency signings. And with Mahomes there too, and a running game as well, you just wonder whether the Kansas City Chiefs could be, along with Houston Texans, could be a team that could really take a big step forward in the AFC this year.
Yeah, it's interesting, and the NFC is interesting too, but for some different reasons. And it'll be interesting to see how the Seahawks respond, because I think that there is certainly an argument to be made to the positive side of the Seahawks and I think there's strengths that are being undervalued right now, especially around the fact that they have Russell Wilson. I mean, we can't really nobody should really be ignoring the fact that Russell Wilson, as compared to Jared Goff, Jimmy Garoppolo, and Sam Bradford / Josh Rosen, is the best quarterback in that division, is the most proven quarterback in that division. And so we have to see if the other two guys or 3 guys will prove that. And that is not true maybe in 2018 if there's a change. But right now, the Seahawks, for all intents and purposes, have the best quarterback in the division. And some good players around him, and they obviously need to figure out the situation with Earl Thomas. But it'll be interesting to watch how that plays out in the coming months, and hopefully the season gets here even sooner than it is supposed to. If we have to maybe cut some time out of the space-time continuum, I'm not a theoretical physicist. I mean, I just made up a word called theoretical. I'm not a physicist in those ranges, so I can't do it. But if we can, I would like to just get the season here right now. So, Rob, any other thoughts before we call it a show?
Well, I really want the NFL season to get here, but I don't want to just skip to the season because I'm enjoying the World Cup too much. I know that it's not really a big hit in America because the United States didn't qualify, but it's just been amazing, not only to see England doing a little bit better than they have done in recent tournaments, but also I think there's been a great tournament. So I'm quite happy for us to skip through time as soon as the World Cup has finished. And the only thing I think you're right, Kenny. Just a final quick point on the Seahawks. I think that you're right that people are underestimating the strengths of the Seahawks, and there are definitely strengths within this team. And I think that there are things that people are going to be surprised about. You hear the national pundits constantly talking about the offensive line, not really acknowledging that Dwayne Brown is going to have a full off season with the team and solves a big problem at left tackle. That they've changed the offensive line coach, which a lot of people were saying they should do. They put a refocus on the offensive line of the running game. So, I think there's some changes there, and also underestimating Pete Carroll's ability to coach up a defense as well. So I think the people are definitely sleeping a little bit on the Seahawks. But I think the counter to that, this is just me being really honest, is that I sometimes find myself thinking, yeah, the Seahawks actually, they've got a chance this year. Why not? There's a lot to like about the Seahawks team. And then I just run through the NFC teams, and I think, yeah, that's the reality check a little bit there, because the NFC's loaded. And whether it's the Eagles coming back, they won the Super Bowl, you could see the Giants taking a step forward. You could see, the Cowboys are going to be competitive. The Redskins are. You look at the NFC North, Minnesota are strong. Of course, they're going to be a major contender. Green Bay always will be with Aaron Rodgers. Detroit and Chicago are going to be a tough out when you face them in the season. Carolina, Atlanta, Tampa Bay, New Orleans, that's a really tough NFC South. And in the NFC West, you've got at least 3 teams in the Seahawks, the Rams, and the 49ers that are going to be very competitive, I think. So it is such a loaded division. And I just wonder if this is, sometimes I think yes, and then sometimes I think, is this a year too soon? Because when the Seahawks were competing for Super Bowls, they were the best. They were the best in the NFC, and it was pretty obvious. And I'm not convinced that they're the best yet, but you don't always have to be the best, and you just have to be the best in the playoffs, as the New York Giants showed, where they won 2 Super Bowls, and they did it with great defense, great pass rush, running game, and Eli Manning playing well in the postseason. So get to the postseason, you never know what happens, and that has to be the target for the Seahawks this year. Just get to the playoffs.
100%. So, yeah, I think I agree with that. And that's it for this edition of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. You can follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staton, and you can go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com to see his articles on the Seahawks and the draft for 2019. And also go to fieldgoals.com. We have an article up today about Frank Clark and Danielle Hunter and the comparison there. So check that out. And this is 3000 NFL Mock Draft. So, subscribe on iTunes. I think I need to change the name again. But for now, I think on iTunes, it's Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur. And that's it. This has been the 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Come back next week for a brand new draft.